All right, today we're diving deep, and I mean deep, into the book of Leviticus to unpack something called the Purification Offering. Now, I know, it might sound like some obscure ancient ritual, but trust me, it unlocks this powerful and, you'll see, surprisingly relevant story about sin, responsibility, and the absolutely incredible nature of God's grace.
But first, let's start with a bit of a puzzle that connects the Old Testament right into the New. So, on one hand, the book of Hebrews tells us that Christ's one single offering has perfected for all time everyone who believes. Perfected for all time. But then you flip over to 2 Corinthians and you see the Apostle Paul telling us to cleanse ourselves from every defilement. So what gives? Are we perfected or do we still need to do some cleansing? Well, the key to unlocking that paradox actually starts, you guessed it, way back in Leviticus.
To solve that puzzle, we have to really get our heads around the specific problem the purification offering was built to solve. And that problem is something the ancient Israelites called unintentional sin.
You see, the Old Testament law drew this really sharp line in the sand between two different kinds of sin. On one side, you've got your unintentional sins. You know, mistakes, things you just plain forgot about, stuff you did in the heat of the moment. But on the other side, there was what they called high-handed sin. This is defiant, premeditated rebellion. It's basically shaking your fist in God's face. And for that kind of sin, there was no sacrifice. But for the unintentional stuff, for that, there was a way forward, a path to forgiveness.
So what does an unintentional sin actually look like? Well, the text gives us some real-life examples. Picture this. You touch a dead animal, which makes you ritually impure, and then you just forget. You forget to go through the cleansing process. Or maybe you're a soldier in a crazy battle, and you promise God anything if he'll get you out alive. But then once you're safe, it totally slips your mind. It's not open rebellion. It's neglect, forgetfulness, or a spur-of-the-moment failure. But, and this is a huge but, here's the crucial point. Even though God graciously sees the difference in our intentions, a violation of his holy law is still a violation. It's still sin. These accidental sins aren't just brushed under the rug. They're seen as coming from a place of neglect and carelessness, and they still had to be dealt with, and seriously.
Okay, so if that's the problem, these unintentional but still very real sins, what was the solution? Well, it was a very specific and very powerful ritual, the Purification Offering.
Now, most of the time we just call this the sin offering, which comes from the Hebrew word katat. But what's really cool is that the root of that same word can also mean to cleanse or to purify. And that's why a lot of smart people today prefer calling it the Purification Offering, because that name really gets to the heart of what the ritual was all about. It wasn't just about the sin, it was about the cleansing.
And here's why that's so important. For ancient Israel, sin wasn't just a personal problem between you and God. It was seen as a kind of spiritual contaminant. It didn't just mess you up, it was believed to actually pollute the tabernacle, the very tent where God's holy presence lived among the people. So one person's carelessness could literally endanger the whole community.
So the ritual itself basically broke down into 3 key steps. First, the worshiper would come and lay their hands on the animal's head, which was a way of saying, this is for me, this animal represents me. Second, the animal was killed. It was this really stark symbol that the penalty for sin, which is death, was being paid by a substitute. And third, the animal's blood was taken and applied to the tabernacle itself, to literally cleanse the sacred space from the pollution of that sin.
This whole thing points to a core theme that runs all through the Bible. Just like the book of Hebrews says, under that old system, purification almost always involved blood. The blood didn't just show that a penalty was paid, it was seen as the actual cleansing agent for God's holy space. Okay, and let's be crystal clear about the goal here. The purification wasn't to protect God from getting dirty. That's not it at all. It was to protect the people from God's perfect, consuming holiness. It made it safe for a holy God to keep living among a sinful people without his fiery holiness wiping them out. The whole thing was for their protection, not his.
Okay, so we've got the problem and we've got the solution. But who was this offering actually for? Well, the answer reveals this really profound lesson about both responsibility and grace.
What's so fascinating is that the offering you had to bring scaled up with your level of responsibility. So, an ordinary person, they'd bring a female goat or a lamb. A leader or an elder, they had to bring a more valuable male goat. But get this, if the high priest, the top spiritual leader, or the entire nation sinned, the cost was a bull, which was the most expensive, most valuable animal.
This whole system teaches a principle that is just as true today as it was then. With great responsibility comes greater accountability.
The sin of a leader, especially a spiritual one like the high priest, had a way bigger, more damaging ripple effect on the community, and the sacrifice had to reflect that seriousness.
But what if you were poor? What if you couldn't even afford a lamb? Well, this is where you really see the incredible compassion built right into God's law. He made a way for the poor. If you couldn't bring a goat, you could bring 2 birds. And if you couldn't even manage that, you could bring a small scoop of fine flour.
I love how one pastor, Kevin DeYoung, puts it. He says, 2 liters of flour for your immortal soul. I mean, come on, that is an amazing deal. It just goes to show that what God wanted most wasn't some expensive sacrifice. It was a repentant heart. He made sure that the path to forgiveness was open to absolutely everybody, no matter if you were rich or poor.
So all of this brings us to the final, and really the most important question. After all this, after the confession, after the ritual, after the blood was applied, what was the ultimate goal? What was the bottom line?
The text of Leviticus doesn't make us guess. In fact, it hammers the point home with this beautiful, powerful phrase that just shows up again and again and again, a guaranteed promise for every single person.
For the sin of the leader, and he shall be forgiven.
For the sin of the ordinary person, and he shall be forgiven.
For the sin of the poor person who could only bring a little bit of flour, and he shall be forgiven. That was the promise. The goal every single time was complete restoration and forgiveness.
And here it is, the key to the whole thing. The animal, the blood, the priest, none of that stuff earned forgiveness. It couldn't. It was all a means to an end, a powerful symbolic act that pointed away from itself to the true source. Forgiveness was always and only ever a gift of grace from God Himself, given to someone with a repentant heart.
And that brings us right back to the puzzle we started with. The purification offering was a physical sign, something you could see and touch, that pointed to the spiritual reality of God's forgiveness. And in the very same way, for Christians today, the Lord's Supper is a sign. The bread and the cup don't save us. They are physical reminders that point us to the one, final, perfect, all-sufficient sacrifice of Jesus, who purifies us once and for all.
The purification offering was this incredible, tangible sign that constantly pointed people back to God's grace. And so maybe the question that leaves us with is this: what are the signs in your life that point you back to that very same grace today?